So the Sunday school lesson here is about historical context. We read a lot of stuff in the Bible, and we read over it. Last time we talked about the Canaanites, and who are the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Amorites. And then we talked about the iniquity of the Amorites. It wasn't complete. We talked about what that meant. Prior to that, we talked about the possibilities of the dates being wrong, because we date things by Egyptology. And the Egyptian dating system may very well be off by several hundred years. Along those lines, I'm still using, in this presentation, in these slides, I'm using the conventional dating. I haven't adjusted things for what we talked about as far as how the Egyptian dating might be wrong. So I'm still using conventional dates because it gives us, it's easier than trying to translate it into the new dating system, which isn't yet widely accepted. So still using the old dating system. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Assyria and Babylon. This lesson is actually going to be a little bit shorter. We read over Assyria and Babylon all the time. We read about them all the time in the Bible. And they loom pretty large in Israel's history. And we have Assyria mentioned 118 times in the Bible. We have Babylon or Babylonia or references made to it, excluding the exile, which of course would add many more, 286 times. But Babylon is mentioned specifically 286 times. And from this, we would think that Babylon is much more important in the geopolitical history of the region than Assyria. The fact of the matter is, Assyrian history far outweighs Babylonian history. Assyrian history actually, remember the Egyptians, when we talked about the Egyptian dynasties, there's the Middle Kingdoms, there's the Late Kingdoms, and that goes on for thousands of years. And the Assyrian history goes actually for thousands of years as well. The Assyrian history is divided into four major periods called the early, the old, the middle, and the Neo-Assyrian history. Whereas Babylon only briefly was the major player in the Middle East. There was a period of time, and we'll talk about this, where Hammurabi, we all know about the Code of Hammurabi, so-called first codification of the law. Bunny trail. If our Egyptian dating problem is corrected, Moses' law, the law coming down from the mountain, precedes Hammurabi's, and so it's the Egyptian dating solves some of those troubles. But Hammurabi, who, as we learned last lesson, was actually an Amorite, expelled from Canaan, goes to Babylon, or the Amorites go to Babylon. Hammurabi was an Amorite, founded the major dynasty in Babylon before the Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar, kingdoms or reigns that brought Babylon to the fore that we all know about. That's the only time that Babylon was ascendant in the Middle East prior to the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So Assyria has this enormous history in the Middle East. Assyria just dominated most of Middle Eastern history during the period from 2600 on. And so we should know a little bit about them. Who were the Assyrians? And that's what I want to talk about mostly. Now you can see I call this the brutal crescent, not the fertile crescent. When we all learned, if you went to public schools, we all learned in public school about the cradle of civilization being the Middle East, and how the Sumerians were the first civilization in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. And the Fertile Crescent, of course, stretches over the top of Israel and kind of around that area. The Assyrians, as we'll see, were extraordinarily brutal people. The Sumerians preceded the Assyrians, but it was more like little city-states. They knew each other. They spoke the same language. There was Sumerian cuneiform, the writing that they had, which fascinatingly lasted up until the 1st century A.D. People were still writing in Sumerian cuneiform, but they didn't actually create an empire of any note. There was a Sumerian culture, but it wasn't an empire. Assyria, on the other hand, created an empire after empire. It takes its name from the city of Assur, although eventually the capital was moved to Nineveh, and there's a lot of what we know about Assyrian history comes from the excavations at Nineveh. The Assyrians were also known as the Subartu, which is a Sumerian name for the Assyrians. The Bible attributes the founding of Assur to Shem's son after the flood. Shem's son named Assur, although secular historians will discount that and say, no, it had nothing to do with it. There's a case to be made that Assur, Shem's son, founded the city and was later deified, that they actually worshipped him. Assur was a god to the Assyrians. The city of Assur was the capital of where this all started, the Assyrian Empire, and so that's where they get their name. It's mentioned as early as Genesis 2:14, and the name of the third river is Hiddekel, that is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. Joel.
That idea of worship, scoff at that. But in Bill Cooper's book, After the Flood, he makes the case that even secular historians will trace the god Jupiter back to Japheth. And this was a thing that they did, and realizing now that we still have ancestor worship throughout the world, that makes it seems to make a lot of sense.
It does. It absolutely does.
There's no reason to discount the story except that, my gosh, it's from the Bible. That can't hardly be, right? So, I don't have any problem with the idea that Assur founded that city and was later deified, and it makes it a little difficult in that, this is the line of Shem. It's a little bit harder to figure out what are the implications of that, and I'm not going to go down that trail. But I will go down this trail a little bit. One of the reasons that you have secular historians who discount the Bible as being written by Moses, the Pentateuch as being written by Moses, is because of things like this. Because Assyria came later in the story. He's referring to something that's much later than the actual time of Genesis, the time of the creation. So it makes it seem anachronistic. It makes it seem like this is out of time. We're referring to something that didn't exist when at the creation. So just keep that in mind. And yet Moses, it doesn't preclude Moses from writing it, because Moses certainly knew about Assyria. And so who's he writing to? Joel.
Not that difficult to deal with, really.
I don't think so.
Yeah, when I say my wife was born in Tennessee, Well, no, she wasn't. She was my wife when she was born in Tennessee. But I can still say my wife was born in Tennessee. Right?
And everybody knows what we mean. Yeah, that's right.
So, and as always, feel free to shout out if I don't see a hand or you've got a question, please. We're most familiar with Assyria as it relates to the Neo-Assyrian period. Remember, there was the early, what do we call them? The early, the old, the middle, and the Neo. So we're going to go through a list of some of these kings, and you're going to recognize their names. Shalmaneser III ruled from 858 to 824 BC. He fought with Ahab of Israel. There are records in the excavations that that verify this. So we have corroboration from not just the Bible, but from secular history. He also fought with Ben-Hadad of Syria, as opposed to Assyria. There were two different nations. Assyria was a little nation inside of the Assyrians. And the Assyrians had to fight with a lot of little nations in the same way that the Israelites ended up fighting with the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. The Syrians were along those lines. If you remember Ben-Hadad, now Ben-Hadad is really just means the son of Hadad, which was the Syrian god. Ben-Hadad was the one who besieged Samaria such that they were eating their own children. If you remember, Ahab's walking the walls and finds out that the women are boiling and eating their own children because the siege was so great that there was no food. He tears his clothes. They see that he's wearing the camel hair undergarments. Anyway, and Elisha prophesied that in the following day, the flour and the wheat would be sold for normal prices, even though you couldn't buy any food. That's the period of time we're talking about here. Shalmaneser was the king, emperor and king of Assyria. Now Jonah, time-wise, Jonah went to Nineveh somewhere between 786 and 746. The next king that we recognize his name from the Bible would be Tiglath-Pileser. Now this would be the third. The Bible doesn't point out the third, the fifth, the fourth, that kind of thing. So we have to be a little bit discerning on the names when you read about Tiglath-Pileser, but we know that this one fought with, he intervened in Ahaz's dispute with Pekah and Rezin. This was outlined in 2 Kings. Tiglath-Pileser was called Pulu in 2 Kings. But again, in the recorded history of the Assyrians, this intervention is mentioned. As a matter of fact, it's detailed, and it matches exactly the way the Bible lays that out. So we have Tiglath-Pileser, we have Shalmaneser the fifth. He fought with Hosea in 2 Kings 18. That one's chronicled, and again we have corroboration from Assyrian records. We have Sargon the second. Sargon the first was way back in the old kingdom. He was essentially the first one to really pull everything together. Sargon took his name, called himself Sargon II. It's Sargon II who was the one who ended up carrying off the 10 tribes. Shalmaneser was the guy who fought the battle, and but he died right as the battle was ending up. Sargon II takes credit for it in all the records in Assyria, because that was their way. But he's the one who carried off the 10 tribes in 2 Kings chapters 17 and 18. Then Sennacherib, we all know about Sennacherib. It was he who fought with Hezekiah and Judah in 2 Kings 19. It was Sennacherib who was sent back with his tail between his legs because the angel of the Lord just put to death his besieging army outside of Jerusalem. However, the records also verify, and the Bible does as well, that Sennacherib conquered all the fortified cities except for Jerusalem. And he says the same. He doesn't say that he lost a battle. The Assyrians were not real big on mentioning any of their defeats or anything that went wrong. They're real chest beaters, as we'll see here in a moment. Some of the quotes from the Assyrians. Esarhaddon was mentioned in 2 Kings 19. He succeeded Sennacherib. He also was one of those guys instrumental in displacing peoples. He would move peoples around. That was the way of the Assyrians. That was the way of a lot of the conquerors in this time period in the Middle East. They would remove the population, as we remember from the stories of Daniel. You know, they moved the population around so that they wouldn't have any attachment to their homeland, hoping that they would be intermarried and eventually just die out. So Esarhaddon is in this line, and Ashurbanipal was the last great king of Assyria from 668 to 627, and we see in Ezra 4:10 that he's mentioned in regards to resettling Samaria with other peoples that he conquered. It wasn't so much that he was pulling people out. All the greater families had already been removed from Samaria that were Jewish, but he was settling other people into Samaria from places that he conquered. So those are the ones that we read about in our Bibles that are part of the Assyrians and the Assyrian history. The Syrians were brutal. A simple beheading was a kindness on part of the Assyrians. This is, like I said, they're chest beaters. This is a typical writing of an Assyrian king. He wrote of himself, he was the trampler of enemies, all enemies, who defeated his enemies and hung the corpses of his enemies on posts. And if you take a look at some of the relief carvings in Nineveh, you'll see this kind of stuff all over there. This is tame. We talk about brutal. Flaying is skinning somebody alive. And the Assyrians were noted for that. The Assyrians ruled by fear of their brutality. I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me and draped their skins over the pile of corpses. Some I spread out within the pile, some I erected on stakes upon the pile. I flayed many right through my land and draped their skins over the walls. How's that for advertising? I felled 50 of their fighting men with the sword. I burnt 200 captives from them and defeated in battle on the plain 332 troops. With their blood I dyed the mountain red like red wool, and the rest of them in the ravines and torrents of the mountains swallowed. I carried off captives and possessions from them. I cut off the heads of their fighters and built therewith a tower before their city. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls. Nice guys. In strife and conflict I besieged and conquered the city. I felled 3,000 of their fighting men with the sword, captured many troops alive. I cut off some of their arms and hands. I cut off others their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I made one pile of the living and one of heads. I hung their heads on trees around the cities. This is Sennacherib himself writes this one. I cut their throats like lambs. I cut off their precious lives as one cuts a string, like the many waters of a storm. I made The contents of their gullets and entrails run down upon the wide earth. My prancing steeds harnessed for my riding plunged into the streams of their blood as into a river. The wheels of my war chariot, which brings low the wicked and the evil, were bespattered with blood and filth. With the bodies of their warriors, I filled the plain like grass. And then I just took this out. It was too detailed. And tore out their privates like the seeds of cucumbers. Graphic stuff. People rightly feared the Assyrians because of that kind of rule, that kind of conquest. To give you a sense of how big the Assyrian Empire was, it encompassed the whole of modern Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, I don't know why Palestine's in there twice, and Cyprus, together with big patches of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Sudan, Libya, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Big, big, big. Here's a little bit of a picture of Assyria from 746 to 609. That in those days was one big empire, a big deal. And all but Jerusalem was pretty well conquered by the Assyrians at some point. So, what happened to the Assyrians? Well, eventually, Nineveh, their capital, was overtaken by the Medes and the Babylonians. They had formed a coalition, an alliance, and Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, was the leader of that alliance. And at 612, Nineveh was overrun. Nineveh was no small place. As you remember from the story of Jonah, the capital of Nineveh was probably 600,000 people in Jonah's time. This was probably a 1 million person city at the time that it fell. There was a Greek general named Xenophon, who you may have heard of, who wrote after he was in the Middle East. He came upon Nineveh, and he was sitting at the foot of some of the walls of what was then a ghost town. It was just abandoned. There was no one there. But the base of the walls was 100 feet deep. And then on top of that was a 50-foot thick wall that went up 100 feet. And it was just a ruin. And of course, we put some stock in what secular historians today say. But secular historians, before Nineveh was rediscovered and excavated in the 1800s, thought that Nineveh was a myth. That Xenophon was just making up a story, and that all of the biblical stuff about Nineveh was just made up. And now it's been discovered, and the reliefs on the walls, the tablets that have been discovered, all of these things confirm everything that the Bible has to say about it, and everything that the ancient historians, Herodotus, Xenophon, all these people were saying about Assyria. So anyway, it was no small thing to take over Nineveh. However they did. Story is that they actually diverted a river, which was something that we'll read about, or what we've heard about before with Babylon. Babylon, of course, happened after this, but they diverted a river that undermined the wall, and that's how they brought down the wall, is that they just diverted it. The people were there inside. They could have withstood a siege for a long time, but the walls couldn't withstand the washing of the river. And so that's how they breached the walls of Nineveh. a large contingent of Assyrians escaped. They moved their capital to Haran, a name that we know. It's where Abram settled for just a little bit. And it was finally defeated, Assyria. The Assyrians and the Egyptians were beaten by the Babylonians at the Battle of Carchemish, which we are very familiar with. That's a battle that's mentioned in the Bible. Mostly it's attributed to beating up the Egyptians, but the Assyrians were the main target. The Egyptians showed up on the scene. It's very unclear whether or not the Egyptians were allied with the Assyrians, or if they were simply trying to take advantage of the situation that was going on. But the Egyptians were sent home at the Battle of Carchemish, and the Assyrians were finally and totally defeated, and we don't hear about Assyria after that any longer. So that was the end of Assyria. From there, we get Babylon, and Babylon was ascendant, but really only for less than 100 years. From 612 to 539 BC were the Babylonians in charge. Now here's the Babylonian Empire at its height. Not nearly as extensive. They didn't overtake Egypt. They didn't overtake all of what we would now call Turkey. But it's still pretty extensive. And they were, in much the same way, they were brutal, like the Assyrians. It's, you do what you know. In Lamentations, it's talked about that they ravished or raped the women in Zion and the maids of cities of Judah. The princes were hanged by their hands. The faces of the elders were not honored. In 2 Kings, it talks about how they slew Zedekiah, or his sons, before his eyes, and then they gouged out his eyes. That's a brutal thing, psychologically. To have your sons slain before you, and it's the last thing you ever saw. That's what you get to see over and over in your mind. That's brutal. Here's something from a rabbinic tradition talking about Nebuchadnezzar was most merciless toward conquered people. By his command, the exiles on their way to Babylon, of course now this is the Israelite exiles, were not allowed to stop even for a moment, as the king feared they would pray during the respite granted them and that God would be willing to help them as soon as they repented. Nebuchadnezzar didn't feel safe until the exiles reached the Euphrates, which was the boundary line of Babylon. Then he made a great feast on board his ship while the princes of Judah lay chained and naked by the river. In order to increase their misery, he had the rolls of the Torah torn and made into sacks, which filled with sand he gave to the captive princes to carry. That's adding insult to injury. That's the kind of psychological brutality that Nebuchadnezzar inflicted. I'm not going to go through the history of Babylon. We pretty well know that as Bible-believing Christians. We've read that. We've heard the stories. But what happened to Babylon? What happened to Babylon? We read in the story of the writing on the hand with the writing on the wall about the great feast. Belshazzar had brought out the golden cups from the temple and was having a party with them. This night he was, of course, killed. He was killed because tradition has it that the Medes and the Persians had diverted the river that flowed through Babylon, and that with the drop in the water level, that the army was able to pass under the iron bars, which only went down to the river level, and come in and open the gates to the city. Tradition holds that Babylon fell without a real fight. And Cyrus, in his writings, says that Babylon fell without a fight. It may be likely that that's exactly what happened, is that besides the traditional story about the river being diverted, that the people in Babylon, people themselves, were happy to have Cyrus kick out the ruling princes of Babylon. They were brutal. They were corrupt. There's quite a bit of evidence to show that the Belshazzar was actually a regent. He wasn't in charge. The son of Nebuchadnezzar was, who was out of the city. And what he was busy doing is he was busy capturing the gods, the idols of the people that they had subjugated, and bringing them into the city of Susa. If you captured the people's gods, they were much less likely to rebel against you. But they obviously were resentful of this. Cyrus, on the other hand, was seen as an extraordinarily tolerant ruler. Cyrus the Great was great because of how he ruled and the extent of his kingdom. It was even bigger than the Assyrians when he's done. But because of his tolerance, it was said that the Babylonians essentially opened their gates to Cyrus. Because then what he did is he restored their gods to them. One of the first things that Cyrus did when he took over in Babylon was he declared that the Israelites were free to go home. He even paid for the rebuilding of their temple. So, I mean, this was a big deal because of his tolerance. Now, I don't want to make believe that he was an enlightened Christian ruler, but he understood the politics of the day, and he understood how to make this all work. And he pretty well got his way by, yes?
Babylon falling without a fight. It seems like there's a small indication of that in Daniel to me, because they're having a banquet which probably takes place in the evening. Probably. Mm-hmm. The banquet is going along pretty far. They call Daniel in when they see the handwriting on the wall.
Yes.
Daniel it took time for this. And then it says that night he was slain. So, I mean, if you're the king, you're probably gonna live a couple days to defend yourself. But if there's not much of a fight, they probably kill him that night. I think the Bible kind of indicates that it wasn't much of a fight at all.
Oh yeah. There's no talk about a battle.
It just happened, and it happened in fortified city after fortified city in the empire of Babylon. They just marched through it and took it over. History is pretty clear on this. So yeah. So here we have the biblical account of the toleration. The first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Also Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and put them in the house of his gods. And it goes on. The account in Ezra is repeated elsewhere too. But it shows Cyrus's tolerance. He wasn't a gentleman, but after an age of extraordinary brutality, thousands of years, the tolerance was remarkable and noticed by historians, and that's up to our day. Cyrus was actually called Messiah in the Bible. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, Messiah, to Cyrus, whose right hand I've holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the 2-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. But, the Bible looks very favorably upon Cyrus, and Cyrus, of course, is another one of the reasons that secular historians attack the Bible. because how could it possibly be written hundreds of years, because Cyrus was named before there was a Cyrus, before there was a hint of Persian Empire. The Persians came out of nowhere. The Assyrians had no idea. They weren't on their map. The Medes, same way. They were not on the map as far as the Assyrians were concerned. And the rise was extraordinary. So, Cyrus the Persian is still revered in Iran as a founder, kind of like a George Washington would be seen in the United States. The Iranians still look back to Cyrus. The Shah of Iran considered himself an heir of Cyrus. The Iranians have a history of a toleration themselves because of Cyrus. Here's a picture of the Persian Empire. As you can see, it's bigger. Cyrus the Great was aptly named. That's a big territory. It was Cyrus who set up, you may have heard of the term satrap. A satrap was something that Cyrus invented. And what he did is he put people from the local culture in charge, alongside of his own people, of course. But they didn't move people around. They let people go home. They let them have their own gods. It was a much gentler way of ruling than the Assyrians and the Babylonians engaged in. So, this just for a little bit of reference, this is a map, a current map of the Middle East, where we have Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. There's the Afghanistan, Pakistan. You know, we have neocons in our government today who think, oh, we should attack Iran. If we're so stupid to attack Iran, which is a mountainous, highly populated, highly motivated, proud people, we would never ever get out of there with our tails. That's a disaster waiting to happen, is an attack on Iran. It's big. That's a big place. Here's Iraq. So we're in Iraq and Afghanistan today, fighting battles that are not going well. We have the Saudis attacking the Yemenis. But anyway, this was the Persian Empire. This is current day, just for reference. And forgive me for my editorial. So, application. There's always more going on behind the scenes than what we know. We read the Bible and we think Babylon is it, man, because of how often the exile is mentioned. And God used that exile for his purposes. There's no question about it. But he used a smaller empire than Assyria. In a sense, if they had the Assyrians taken over Judah and taken the people out of Judah like what Babylon did, it's not nearly as likely they would have been preserved as a people. Because of the brutality of the Assyrians, it's much more likely that they would have been scattered to the four winds, as were the 10 tribes. 10 tribes were not reassembled. So we have that as far as application, is to say, just because it's big in my life doesn't mean there isn't stuff going on elsewhere. We need to always lean on the sovereignty of God and trust him and know that he's got something in mind for our good, regardless of what the challenge might be. That's something. It's going on behind the scenes. God moves kings and nations for his own purposes. He can move employers, family members, health, war in the same way for our chastisement and for our good, as he did in the Middle East over a long period of time. Had Cyrus not defeated the Babylonians and allowed the Jews to return to the Promised Land, to Canaan, it would have been a different history than what we have now. You can't say, well, there wouldn't have been a Christianity because God's sovereign, you know? But the way the things were orchestrated, you can see God's hand moving through. It's kind of like a golden thread that he weaves through that history to accomplish his purposes. Cyrus was just a piece of that. Nebuchadnezzar was a piece of that. Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal and all those other guys, they were all a piece of that. It's interesting to note that in Israel history, in the Old Testament, when the Jews returned to Israel from Babylon, there's no evidence of idol worship, at least in the sense of a physical idol. The exile would appear to have wrung out of them the idea of idol worship. They gave it up. You didn't see it anymore. So there's a question that we should ask ourselves is what chastisement of our own, what challenges that we're running through in our own lives, which are kind of like an exile, what are necessary to weed out our own idols? That's something that we should think about as an application that we can take from the history here. God's using chastisements that he understands that we don't, and we should be looking for those and looking at those perhaps differently than what we do. We talked about it a little bit today, just talking about counting it joy when we run into trials and tribulation. We should count that joy. We should be looking for what God is working at in our lives. What's he trying to weed out? Why is he trying to get our attention? There's another point here, and I think that's the last slide, yeah. The collapse of the Assyrian Empire, the collapse of the Babylonians, the collapse when Cyrus was off the scene, and he was only on the scene for a short period of time, much like Alexander the Great. He conquered. It's unclear. Nobody knows how exactly he died. Herodotus tells one story. Other historians tell another story. He either died in his bed or he died fighting a nomadic queen on the northeastern borders of his empire. But when these empires collapsed, it left an enormous void. It's almost as if, try to imagine what this world looks like if 15 years from now, 20 years from now, there's no United States, right? The overreach has finally caught up with us. The United States falls apart in a civil war, or it's taken out by the Chinese, whatever. There's no United States. There's no center. There's no hegemonic power in charge. What does that look like? People are going to be looking over their fences saying, what do we do now? And I think that there's a lesson for us as well in taking a look at when these empires disappear, of the opportunities that we have now as Christians to say, well, let's raise up a Christian world. We should be ready to fill that void. It's incumbent on us to be ready. We talk about this all the time in our Reconstructionist circles. You know, we're trying to apply the Bible to all of life, not just Sundays and not just our personal piety, but we're supposed to apply it to education, which is why we just had that conference. We should apply it to politics, what you talked about today. Apply it to all these things. We need to be ready to fill that void, because there will be a void at some point. There's always going to be a void. What we see in these battles and these rises and falls of empires is that there are opportunities there for God's people to fill the gap, to stand in the gap. Whenever I hear that, stand in the gap, I think of Moses coming down from the mountain and standing there. Who's on the Lord's side? You know, and we need to stand ready to fill that, to stand in that gap and to say, well, we're ready, send us. So it's a little bit shorter today, but that's a little bit of background on Assyria and Babylon, a little bit of application. Are there any questions, complaints, comments, criticisms? Ben's smiling, but... All right. Well then, I'll close in prayer and we'll be done. Father God, we thank you for the history that you have preserved for us from ancient days. Pray that we would be able to understand it, that we would be able to apply it to our circumstances today, we'd be able to learn from it, and that in whatever way possible that we could use it to lay up bricks in your kingdom, to edify your church and make it more relevant and more important to our secular friends, and that we would simply see our role as good soldiers in your kingdom, and that we would fulfill those roles. We pray these things in Christ's name.